Welcome to RHI Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today, we are joined by Matthew Daus, a partner at the law firm Windles, Marks, Lane, and Mittendorf, where he founded and chairs the Transportation Practice Group. He also serves as president of the International Association of Transportation Regulators and chair of New York's Transportation Research Center at the City College of New York. He was the longest serving commissioner, chair, CEO of the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission.
It's hard.
Hey Matt, it's so great to see you, and I'm so happy that we're revisiting from your earlier interview about 5 years ago.
Yeah, it's been way too long since our last interview, Jim. It's good to see you again, and it's great to be here, and it's always good to just touch base and see how things have changed and are changing because they are changing more than they're staying the same in our field. And kudos to you and RHI for all the nightlife mayors. I remember when we first met over 20 years ago, this was not a thing. It didn't exist. And then Amsterdam came along, and then with the hospital, the nightlife zones and the conferences that you've held, you've really made an impact over the years with the organization. So I think every city is going to have a nighttime mayor, and hopefully it'll take transportation and transportation safety at night as mobility evolves very, very seriously on the road to Vision Zero.
Well, along those lines of mobility, I mean, this is a term that used to be considered transportation, but now it's mobility because it's inclusive of a lot of things other than buses and cars and trucks. But micromobility now is really narrowing the field down more specifically to another dimension of mobility. But can you, in a elevator speech, define micromobility?
Yeah, sure. So micromobility involves small, lightweight vehicles for short urban trips, like e-scooters or e-bikes, and it's typically on average less than 100 pounds in weight, and they typically go less than 15 miles per hour. Though you might have some bikes and e-bikes that go over 20 miles per hour. There's two types of systems. Obviously, there's the privately owned. I mean, I have an e-bike, I have an e-scooter that I own. And then there's also the shared systems, which has really attracted a lot of private development and folks from the Silicon Valley community to invest in some of these companies because they utilize apps and they're part of shared systems. Like one of the first big shared systems was, of course, New York City City Bike, which has now been acquired by Lyft. And every major city now, from the beginning of that experiment, has these shared systems. And there's two ways to go about it. It could be a city-owned franchise or a micromobility run shared bike or scooter program, which some cities have, or it could be one where you get permits and you're subject to regulation, and you can promote your own company through your app and through your own endeavors. And obviously it involves curb space and infrastructure. The whole point of this, allowing people to get around when it's congested, helping the environment. People don't even have to use or buy a car. They can get around cities in an environmentally friendly, zero emissions way. And they don't even have to own their own scooter or bike in some cities, right? So it allows people who do not have high income levels to get mobility to and from work. Honestly, in Manhattan, even with congestion pricing, when I have to take short trips, I don't even jump on the subway or the bus. I take my e-scooter or my e-bike to the office. So it's a way to get around. And obviously, there's a lot of issues when you're in an urban environment. Where do you park them? Where do you put them? Do you allow them into buildings? But this whole movement, Jim, started, and I was, gratefully involved in some of the policy making in Santa Monica, in parts of California. I think those were some of the beginnings on the West Coast. And before the pandemic, there was a lot of opposition to micromobility systems and people just jumping these things on the street. And now it's changed. Now there's regulation, it's normalized. And during the pandemic, people started using them. And now it's become a way of life as we come out of the pandemic. And cities are not opposing it the way that they did in the beginning. Remember, they opposed Uber and Lyft when they
Yeah.
were going rogue. Now it's like mainstream, and it's led to so many other things that are positive for the industry. And not only is there venture capital funding that's involved in these companies, but the MDS program that I worked on with Jarvis Murray from LADOT, who I know you know, under Salita Reynolds when she was the commissioner of LADOT, we did a taxi project that led to the mobility data specification, where all the bikes and scooters are being left all over the street, and we needed a way to track them. So the government wanted to get access to the data so that we could figure out who was just leaving, the bikes in the middle of the boardwalk on Santa Monica, and Venice Beach. And that led to a bunch of lawsuits, which were resolved. And now this Open Mobility Foundation exists, which has worked with LA and a lot of other cities around the country, where they're not just getting bike and scooter micromobility data, but they're also now putting taxi and other data on the platform so that regulators can manage the curb in the streets better. So a lot has changed and evolving, and it's much more mainstream now, and growing as opposed to before the pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember those days. I remember Bird was really the first, and they just kind of dumped
Mhm.
scooters on a city, and cities just went nuts, and they were throwing them into the ocean, I mean, yeah, I remember there
Yeah.
was not a lot of happy people, but it still poses some impacts or challenges. So what would be, these are all of the positive things that you're talking about, but what are some of the impacts that are still outstanding in terms of these uses? And of course, much of what you spoke about is more the business kind of consumer directed model, but
Mhm.
not necessarily, uh, you know, and how to regulate them, how to make them much more controlled and organized. But there's other kinds of issues, particularly at night, and especially when you're talking about safety of the consumer. And, all of this information that's being directed to the vehicles and where they park and, how they manage it. What's the direction relative to the consumer, the user of the product? And you have a lot of safety features that might be applicable to like motorcycles, but not necessarily applicable to these
Mhm.
e-bikes, which I know you mentioned 15 miles an hour, but I've seen some of them where I live that keep up with the traffic at 30 miles an hour.
Mhm.
So, and there are people riding in the street, and how do you start to regulate the vehicles from the driver's perspective rather than from the
Mhm.
mechanical aspect of it?
Well, it's a good question. I think it's a combination of training, enforcement, and safety first. And from a consumer's point of view, it's all about the safety. But remember, this is also evolved into a delivery model. During the pandemic, when packages needed to be delivered, there was the Amazons of the world, and the folks in the taxi industry kind of stepped up and they were delivering packages. After the dust settled, we saw more and more bikes, and even shared bikes and shared scooter systems being used by delivery workers or deliveristas to bring packages and Uber Eats and food to folks. So that has really evolved over time. So the regulation is not just safety oriented; it's geared towards the worker. And there's urban planning going on in terms of where you put them on the street and how you manage them. Still a lot more work that needs to be done on that front, but there's liability issues for cities, and cities are actually looking at, instead of shunning them, partnering with them. For instance, I just completed a report that was financed through my university. Actually, my law firm did it. No, Windows Marks. We were hired by the Transportation Research Board, the Transit Cooperative Research Program. We just did a whole big report on micromobility and the legal issues when public transit agencies try to partner with and make part of the ecosystem. And that's why we call it mobility, Jim. It's not siloed anymore. Thankfully, it's an ecosystem that's getting recognition by regulators, government, and academics that it's not just public transit doing their own thing with buses and trains, but transit agencies like SFMTA and others around the country are more nimble in doing first and last mile partnerships where, you know, and when you get to the end of the line, the last 2-3 miles home, you can go to a mobility hub, hopefully, and either get a scooter or a bike to take to your apartment complex, or hail a Lyft or an Uber that's part of your journey. That's where I think the movement is going as we get closer to mobility as a service and public transit agencies partnering with these different modes. But micromobility, whoever thought it would be on the menu? It is on the menu, and it cries out for regulation. There's still a lot more work that needs to be done because in a congested city like Manhattan, for instance, you have bike lanes and they operate on bike lanes, and there needs to be order to the chaos. And that's, I think, a challenge for every city is making sure that traffic fatalities and incidents don't go up, but they go down over time. While we're helping the environment, help people get around, safety is the big issue. And we've already seen in some cities that there's, growing concern, not just about sidewalk clutter, like, Washington, D.C., for instance, has, they have speed governors and sidewalk riding restrictions and geofencing. There's also in Chicago, they provide regulations for locking up the scooters and spreading the devices equitably among neighborhoods. There's a lot of focus by policymakers, obviously not just on the equity or the provision of appropriate wages to the deliverysters, but anyone who's using these vehicles. There's a big concern about what neighborhoods that they're being put into. Like some of the cities have only allowed certain communities to get access to the e-scooters. New York's a good example. It's not in Manhattan's core where we have a shared system, but they're experimenting in the Bronx and other parts of the city. I'm not a big fan of having a franchise monopoly like City Bike has had. I don't think it's a problem to have a system like we have a public transit system, but we should allow for competition. There was a company that came along that was using private parking garages to park the e-bikes, and they wanted to do a bike share. The name of the company was Joco, and the city tried to shut them down. Now, eventually, during the pandemic, when they started this business model, their orange bikes started being used by the delivery workers. So now they only do deliveries and they don't do it for the general public. But that's like, not having competition is not good for this marketplace, whether it's scooters or I think e-bikes. And I think, we're going to see in the nightlife economy, Jim, we're going to see that there's an enhanced potential danger for people taking these devices to get home. I mean, if they're workers, that's one thing. I think this is great for people when there's a congestion in a nightlife district and they're looking to get home at 4 a.m. when the bars close, and they work at the bar and they're not drinking, they're not intoxicated. Those people, that we should have the ability for them to take e-bikes and e-scooters. Some cities have actually gone as far with respect to patrons and just people in general to put curfews that you have hours of operation. You're not allowed to be on the street, with a scooter. Past a certain hour. I think Helsinki, Finland, actually passed a law, if I'm not mistaken, about that. So I think we're going to see, as it evolves, more and more regulation. Hours of operation, especially at nighttime. Curfews, geofencing in hospitality zones, and I do believe that when it comes to planning, we really need to focus on, like, I think DC, where you've done a lot of work with RHI, they have actually done, I think, a really impressive effort of putting PUDOs, pick-up and drop-off zones, near Connecticut Avenue and DuPont Circle. They engage nightlife and hospitality industry folks, as well as the mobility industry, to come up with PUDOs that are implemented with a series of parking restrictions that go along with it, ensuring that there's proper enforcement and towing of the vehicles and putting up cameras. So I think it's a combination of urban planning, training, and enforcement. Like right now, the police department in New York is trying to enforce the law, and education, and also, working with the companies to have responsible placement of their shared systems, or to encourage use that's safe and appropriate by their passengers, including maybe a training program that you have to sign up for when you first download the app. Now, they don't want to hear that because everybody wants their companies to have their app downloaded and people are scooting right away. But I think from a liability standpoint, it's not just of concern for the companies, but anyone who partners with them or is a city that allows them needs to be cognizant of the fact that they may be creating a duty of care, where if they put scooters in a certain area or on a curb that they could be creating liability for themselves. But the times have changed, right? It's like this is something when it first came out, nobody wanted them, and it was like they were like public enemy number one, sort of like when Uber and Lyft came on the scene, right? Now they become normalized, and we're seeing an evolution here. But it's going to be a combination of planning, safety regulations, with specific and extra regulations for nightlife. Because we don't want people getting intoxicated and taking scooters and bikes home. I know it happens. Safety, things get more safe as things scale. And night is particularly, there's higher level of crashes at night, right? But like when motorists get accustomed to seeing the bikes and scooters and to look out for them, as you see more and more of them, that creates a safety benefit, right? Because it's not like this one-off rogue scooter that comes out of the blue. Motorists get accustomed to adjusting the defensive driving techniques, right? So honestly, it should be part of every single DMV. I don't know if it is something to look into. Defensive driving courses should, include the motorists looking out for the scooters, because it's an ecosystem, like bus drivers, motorists, people driving cars, and the scooter users themselves all should have safety, front of mind, because you're not protected. You're on a bike, you're on a scooter. Speed restrictions are implemented in many cities. They require that the scooters, if you get an authorized permit, not go above a certain miles per hour, usually 10 or 15 miles per hour. But it's going to be hard to get the rogue people under control, because some people just buy their own scooters and do their own thing.
Their own thing, yeah. Well, it seems to me like you're going from micro mobility to micromanagement of a lot of these systems, and we're running close to our end. And I wanted to throw something out to you, because I've seen now some stories about robotic deliveries, and now you have Musk, who's claiming that he's going to have 100,000 driverless vehicles as taxis. And where do you see the evolution of that? And I remember when Uber and Lyft first started, part of their business model was really to just saturate the market, take over the taxi consumer, set the prices, and then the one cost that they have to eliminate is the driver. And that is kind of the potential of these shifts and changes. But also, if you start using drones, not only are you regulating the bike lanes and the sidewalks and the road traffic, now you're dealing with a three-dimensional regulation. How are you going to avoid drones crashing into each other, or things that might cause harm? What's your membership looking at in terms of the regulatory aspect, where you don't have drivers or users of these vehicles, but they're all computers, and there is always the potential of them not really working?
Well, it's a good question. I think some of our regulatory members at ITR are involved in this, like the NTA, California PUC. Some of these regulators have really gone into the weeds. Like California has very strict laws. New York City DOT has some strict laws on automated vehicles. Others, like Arizona, Texas, they have less regulation. So the companies have been going to those cities and states where there's less regulation. But it's scaling. It's over 25 states that have either testing and deployment laws, and we're going to be testing Waymos in New York City, hopefully before the end of the year. So it's happening. It's real. It's safe. I believe it's, the only way we're going to get to Vision Zero is through automation. So our regulators, this paradigm is still evolving, right? So for automated vehicles, I think the future is going to be scaled very slowly. Since Uber became a mainstream player, at the beginning, remember, Jim, they had no regulations. They were fighting regulations. Now, actually, I think they're being regulated more as a trend than the other industries that compete with them, taxis and limos. To some extent, when maybe background checks and fingerprints are one thing, but there's a lot of pressure from the regulators and a lot of the progressives in big cities are moving towards decent pay for the delivery workers and the drivers. They're center of this debate. Seattle, New York passed the minimum wage law years ago. Seattle passed it as well for Uber drivers and scrapped it. So the big issues that what are the big issues Uber and Lyft are dealing with right now that's causing problems for them? Insurance and tort reform is a big issue. The insurance costs are high. There's a lot of crashes. They look at them as deep pockets. That's a problem. They're getting more regulation when it comes to caps, that like New York City capped the number of vehicles so they can't grow. And also driver wages. Those are the three big issues. So automation kind of makes some of those issues, go away. But I actually think Uber was smart to stop doing it on their own and having their own vehicle, which failed miserably. And now they're partnering with Waymo and other providers in the field as a platform. So I think the big chunk of business that's going to be lost are going to be the younger folks that think it's a cool thing and they're going to, Phoenix and showing up and they're downloading the Waymo app. I think it's going to become one way to get around, but it's not going to scale and take over everything, right away. I think limos are still going to be limos. People are going to pay top dollar to have a driver in there. Even if the car drives itself and it's in self-drive mode, there's still going to be a worker in that car. NEMT is very challenging. Non-emergency medical transit, accessible vehicles, people who need help to get in and out of the car with a wheelchair. I don't think that's going to be affected. I honestly don't think most of it's going to be affected right away, but it is happening. It's real. It's safer, and it's getting safer by the day. And the bots are great too. Like I think LA has and DC has. There's a company I think called Coco that is coming to our conference this year. So these companies, it's real and it's not taking jobs away from people because they're micro deliveries. They're going from the bodega around the corner, or they're operating like pedestrians, and they're very safe because they stop. And the biggest issue is, people thought there would be vandalization of these bots, and it really hasn't happened. And they are, if you go to DC or LA, they're on the street delivering things. And I think drones are right up there. Now it's a little bit more complicated, drones, but there is a framework that the FAA has. And flying taxis and drones are a thing, and they are happening. And I think actually that's going to scale, I think, faster than robotaxis on the ground. I think robotaxis will scale, but believe it or not, Professor Shaheen convinced me many years ago, Susan Shaheen, that that UAM and advanced air mobility is a thing, and it is because the skies are wide open. Now in New York City, we're doing a project where the downtown Manhattan heliport is going to have these, one day one of these quiet four-rotor, aircraft that's going to take people to the airports. I mean, Blade is a helicopter company that's been doing it for years, not just to take people to the Hamptons, but to take people to the airport in under 5 minutes from Manhattan. So I do believe that as the streets get more crowded and the sidewalk gets more cluttered and the bike lanes get more cluttered, we need to look to the skies. And I think drones and flying taxis are gonna come sooner than you think.
Wow. So, I mean, and then the next thing, we're going to need a RoboCop, that's going to be a robot that's going to enforce the robot laws, because they're going to need to be able to communicate with the robotics, right? So you're going to have a computer communication system. Well,
Well,
this
they
has
already
been,
have the robot dogs, right? I mean, Cambridge Systematics. I think the NYPD purchased some of those dogs, and they're
yeah,
out there doing
yeah.
bomb sniffing. And the
Well,
first
I
robots
talked,
were,
I
some of the bomb squad did some of
yeah, I
those things
talked with,
years ago.
Darrell Stevens, who used to be with the Major Cities
Hmm.
Chiefs. He talked about how they're experimenting with robotic police, and
Hmm.
but that with artificial intelligence, these robots can scan a crowd, because obviously there are certain indications of a person who's approaching a point of committing a crime,
Hmm.
and you can identify those behaviors. I mean, that's what cops are trained to do, is to monitor a crowd and to be able to pinpoint individuals who may be moving into a risky situation, and
Hmm.
that computers can do the same thing once they're oriented to that. And that's what he said, that there'll be robots that are monitoring crowds and being able to pinpoint situations that might be of a risk situation. So, yeah, the world
Well,
is changing.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I forget what his name was, Murphy in RoboCop. I don't think we're going to see any Officer Murphys around as soon as we will see what is already happening, automated enforcement, Jim. The cameras, the red light cameras, the speed cameras, they're real, they're scaling. New York, Miami. I think the future when it comes to, policing the street for traffic enforcement is going to be done by cameras that have sophisticated AI, and they would be able to read plates and issue summonses and give you a robo summons, so to speak. So I see that happen. It's already happening in major
Hmm.
cities, and I think we're going to see more of that. And I think what's interesting is a lot of people don't notice, but in New York City, there's 30,000 Nexar telematics cameras that are recording in Uber vehicles. The Uber drivers put them in on their own. They bought them. The Black Car Fund started a pilot program with Nexar, and the drivers want to protect their 5-star ratings, so they've been putting in these cameras so they can record passengers when they have a dispute. But at the same time, the front-facing camera, which is a telematics camera like anything else, they're looking to record crashes or near incidents for safety training purposes and insurance discounts and to resolve lawsuits. That you can find any street, pinpoint any street through those cameras and the AI at any point in time in New York City. There's actually an electric eye on the streets in the private sector with these cameras, and also the police department has cameras everywhere in New York City. So we're increasingly getting to a new world in cities and urban environments where there's cameras everywhere, and everything can be tracked and recorded. And I think summons generation and enforcement is going to scale rapidly. It's already happening. I mean, we just had it started out with school zones. When people politically oppose these things, it's all about the kids. Let's protect the kids. So usually we'll see in a city that there'll be cameras that are allowed by the legislature in areas that protect schools. Now it's scaling everywhere, and you don't have to hire cops anymore
Hmm.
or traffic enforcement. It could all be done automatically, and you have the right to contest the summonses and so forth. But um, I wrote an article on intelligent speed assist also. What are we going to do about people who continue to violate these laws too? A big problem in New York City with these cameras is that if you can afford to pay the summonses, people are racking up hundreds of summonses and with no repercussions. So they just continue to, speed and run red lights. And if they can afford to pay, then they're off the hook, right? So that has to be addressed in some way. And there's some bills floating around in New York, but it's all about technology, right? Technology, multimodalism, connections. That's what ITR is focusing on. I think, I'm sure when, you start delving into some of the work of the nightlife mayors over the next 5 to 10 years, they're going to also be focusing on these solutions to help keep hospitality zones safe at night,
Hmm.
but also to provide options for people to get home. I do believe it's great if, business improvement districts or, bars and restaurants can actually get together and provide for private scooter and bike shares for the employees to get home, at
Yeah.
night instead of having to wait, an hour for a bus or to sit in a traffic jam when you're getting out of downtown Orlando as a worker at the minute when the bars are closing and you can't find an Uber because all the patrons are still hanging out at food trucks like they do in Austin, right? So
Hmm.
so hey, this is a lot going on, Jim, since we first started and first met
Yeah,
each
no,
other
and this
over
has been
over two
great.
decades ago.
You gave a great encyclopedia of everything that's going on around micromobility and micromanagement. I think the two are starting to merge together, whereas they didn't exist before. It was more
Mhm,
when you first spoke in 2015, the management aspect of it was more macro, looking just at the
mhm,
basic, they're dumping cars on the street without any regulation. I mean, that's just like the main thing. But now you're talking down to the level of the speed controls and the
mhm.
geofencing and all of the other types of micromanagement that's going on with micromobility. Well, Matt, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate your time. I know you're a busy guy, and I read your newsletter, and you're always introducing really important and groundbreaking
Thank you.
innovation. So, but I want to thank you, and
You're
we'll be in
welcome.
touch.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim. So good to see you.